If you've been involved at all in the competitive Overwatch community this year, you've probably heard the idea of role queue or 222 lock thrown around liberally. The idea that introducing a system in which each team of 6 players had a set number of each role, being tanks, DPS, and supports, is not a particularly fresh concept at this point, but it's certainly one that seems to be gaining momentum, in large part due to the prevalence of triple tank, triple support, also known as GOATs. If you, like many, have been growing bored of GOATs, there may finally be some good news for you.
In an article published on June 24th on Upcomer, Sasha Heinisch, better known as Yiska in the Overwatch community, stated that sources had informed Upcomer that the Overwatch League would be moving towards a 2-2-2 role lock for the 4th stage of the 2019 season. Previously, there had been reports that the role lock would be coming to the Overwatch League at the start of Stage 3, but this was reportedly vetoed by the league, despite rumors that all 20 teams had expressed interest in the change to the rule set.
Alright, so lafon, let's get this out of the way. What's your general opinion of role queue and 222 lock?
I think in general, Overwatch was always trending towards it. I mean, if you think back to the early days of Overwatch when we had basically, there was no hero limit, right? And eventually that became the nature of the game. And we see that today where you only see one hero allowed to be played by a team at a time. And I think eventually 222 role lock was the evolution of that particular idea to the next stage.
Well, and it makes sense too, considering things we've seen with the development team. I believe it was Stylosa talking to Jeff Kaplan earlier this year about role queue, and Jeff was saying that it'd make balancing the game so much easier. So if the development team and the community is on board for it, it makes sense that eventually it would happen, right? But this is kind of a weird time for it to come into the Overwatch League specifically, considering we've gone through 75% of the season before this change, and it's not exactly the prettiest look for the last bit of the league.
No, and that's actually one of the things that I've been very vocal about my complaints about this particular report. I have to be honest with you. I've long said that changes more than halfway through the season are bad for competitive integrity. And at its core, Overwatch League is a competitive esport. And so the fact that we're changing it not at the start of Stage 3, but at Stage 4 is to me a grave misstep in how Overwatch League is sort of running their methods.
Well, I mean, to be fair, we don't know exactly why it's Stage 4 instead of Stage 3, right? To me, it kind of seems like it was probably in the works since well before Stage 2 even, most likely, but maybe it wasn't ready on a technical side or something of that nature, but it's not exactly going to be the most balanced way to head into the last stage, especially considering that it's gonna shift the meta ridiculously.
Yeah, don't get me wrong, I totally get why there are technical reasons it might not have happened, and I am very cognizant of the developer time involved, but before we head into the meta theory, I want to reiterate that you have two choices, right? In my opinion, and that's either at the start of Stage 3 when you're only 50% of the way through the season, and so you still have half the season to work with, or at the beginning of next season, that's when you implement sort of these grandstanding changes, because a stage could be a big difference for some of these teams, towards the later half of the bracket, which conveniently we can now talk about meta because it could shift quite a bit, and I actually expect it will.
Oh yeah, I mean, you just go on Twitter, you click any random Overwatch League player's account, and they're just raving about how Orisa is, secretly overpowered or just ridiculous to play against. I mean, even in Overwatch competitive ranked at the highest levels recently, it's been Orisa, so it wouldn't be too surprising to see that particular hero become a foundation for whatever the Stage 4 meta is.
Yeah, I think that's one of the worries I have, especially. This is at a personal level. I do not want to see Sombra played, and I do not want to see Orisa played. I find both those characters to be very boring to watch, so that is a personal, obviously, misstep. And I do really enjoy watching the 3-3 composition. But no, back to the meta, sort of theory crafting here. The expectation is we're gonna see a lot of bunker. We're gonna see a lot of Orisa based compositions, and this is a mirror of last season where Through 3 stages, we sort of had one dominant meta, and then at the end of stage 3, there was a huge shift, and then we saw a ton of Orisa played. So it's looking for the second straight season for that to be the case.
Well, there are other theories floating around out there, right? Not just Orisa, but keeping in mind that Orisa wouldn't necessarily be good on every single map in Overwatch. I mean, maybe every single assault map, but not all of the maps, right? So maybe we'd see something like Double Sniper come back. Maybe we would see Doomfist Sombra, or Hackfist as they're calling it these days, shift into the meta. It's hard to say at this point, but you can definitely say it won't be anything close to what we're seeing now.
Yeah, I would fully agree with that, simply because you can't have the 3-3, right? So by the very nature of that being the case, then you would obviously throw away an entire composition, which a ton of teams are still running. I mean, obviously your top end teams in the Shock and the Titans, but also some of the, the lower ranked teams in who are running the Sombra Goats, because as we've seen, the Sombra Goat still relies on the 3 supports. So we'd see that go away as well. So your teams like the Valiant, the Outlaws, the Spark, of course, these teams would all shift away from that. And so essentially through the entirety of the league, we would see basically 20 teams, maybe barring 1 or 2, say that, the Shanghai Dragons, for example, barring those couple of teams, it would be the entire league changing at once.
Invest in the stock of the Chinese teams right now. Teams like Chengdu, they've been running DPS all season long. They're gonna be having a ball when we get to a DPS meta in stage 4, should this actually be the case, right? But let's actually talk about this stage specifically, because according to the article on Upcomer, right, Overwatch League teams were informed at the beginning of June that Rollock would be coming for stage 4. Right now, there haven't been very many patch changes between stage 2 and 3, but despite that, we've seen a ton more DPS. Could that be related?
I mean, there's certainly the expectation, right? Especially for some of the teams that are really bad at the 3-3 composition. If you knew about it, rather than wasting an entire stage trying to just get better at 3-3 when you know it's going to be, taken away from you at the end in stage 4, it may make sense to just try and grind out the DPS compositions, the 2-2-2. That might actually be the root of, some of the more varied compositions we've been seeing recently. That honestly, unless you're a Shock or a Titan, a Titans team, then you might say, well, we know we're not really going to get advantage in these compositions, so let's try and vary our stock before the inevitable change comes through.
Yeah, I mean, makes sense, right? And just look at the Houston Outlaws, right? They say, you know what? We're done with 3-3. We're going to try and do anything else, and it works out for them now. They might even be able to make it into the play-ins for end of season playoffs, thanks to, a meta shift that was maybe a bit artificial in terms of, how the game is actually being played.
Right. And I think one of the things to note too is that some of the compositions we're seeing are actually still revolving around the fact that Goats is so strong. If we look at the Sombra Goats, for example, or even Hackfist, right, where you see the Sombra Doomfist, these compositions work specifically against Goats. So I'd say that even though we saw a ton of DPS play in stage 3, I would expect that the compositions we see in stage 4, if the Rollock were to come into play, would be vastly different, simply because those compositions we did see were in fact catered towards dealing with the Goats composition rather than being an inherently good 2-2-2 composition on its own.
All right, we've talked about that. Now let's talk about Overwatch in general for this, right? Because at the moment, there is no word on whether or not this is just a change for the Overwatch League or if this will be implemented into the actual game at large. Whether you and me and everybody else will go into their ranked games, their competitive games, and also be playing 2-2-2. Now, I, for one, am not too much a fan of the idea that the professional level of a game and the more casual level of a game have different rule sets. I think it's a bit more disillusioning, and for the casual viewer, it's not as much fun to watch the pros then.
I mean, counterpoint to that, though, is that how often are you going to see in your random ranked games or your quick play games Goats compositions, right? So the argument could be made that even though you may not see that 2-2-2 lock come into your own play or into your own games itself, the argument could be made at the pro level, you're not seeing that anyway. You can still play those heroes, right? But you won't be able to, the 2-2 lock. You can still have the quad DPS or the 3 tanks or whatever the case may be. I think that the fact is already basically the pro level and the casual level are so vastly different that, in my opinion anyway, it doesn't really make a difference.
I mean, sure, on like the macro sense, right? But I'm talking more like micro, right? If I'm somebody wanting to improve at like Widowmaker or something, right? And I go into, Overwatch League and I go, all right, what are the best Widows doing? What can I be doing to get better, right? And they're forced into a 2-2-2 lock, but then I go into my ranked games, try and play Widowmaker, and there's 4 other DPS, or there's 5 tanks on my team, and I'm the only Widow. That's not exactly a fun situation.
I mean, for sure, but that's always been the argument, right? And I think that eventually we are going to see some form of role queue or role lock coming to Overwatch, because that, again, as we highlighted at the very beginning, is how this game is trending towards. But I think at the moment, that particular argument, for me anyway, doesn't really hold water, simply because of all the facts that, again, the pros are playing a different game.
All right, but transitioning back to the actual pro level now, lafon, let's talk about specifics on how this might affect Overwatch League. Who are your top teams to benefit, and who are your top teams to lose out because of this 2-2-2 lock?
I think the very obvious one is the San Francisco Shock. I think even if they have fantastic DPS players, which they do, they have fantastic players at every single role, the fact of the matter is that right now they're the best team in the Overwatch League. And so with the Titans having just lost to the Valiant, the Shock are going to lose no matter what. So I think they're the biggest losers for me. I think also, surprisingly, the Valiant might be one of the bigger losers, simply because, again, they've been playing Somber Goats very, very well, and they are very much not going to be able to do that going in. And I think in terms of winners, you said this before, but I think the Chinese team, specifically, Chengdu Hunters, or even Hangzhou Spark, who have really good DPS players waiting in the wings. And lastly, Philadelphia Fusion.
Philly. Ooh, spicy take right there. Makes sense, right? They've been not so much struggling this season. They're just solidly middle of the table, right? Right now in the overall standings, they're sitting at 10-8, which is respectable, right?
Yeah.
But, Philly Fusion, one of the 2 grand finalists from last year, you kind of go in hoping that they maybe pop off a little bit more this year, and you can't exactly pop off in a 3-3 meta, but if we get 2-2-2, Philly Fusion, that's a good point, actually.
Right. I think the biggest thing, too, is that you've got Carpe and EQO on your team, right? And
oh, yeah.
Carpe has struggled on the Zarya. That is very evident. With the ability to move towards a more DPS-centric meta, where his Widowmaker can come out to play, where his Tracer maybe even, those kind of characters, you might expect to see a much more solid showing from the Philadelphia Fusion. And I think EQO as well is another player that has long benefited from DPS play. So I think that is honestly one of the things that just vaults them towards the top of my list.
Well, and you make a good point too about players that don't necessarily slot into 3-3-3 properly, but maybe can find their fit in a specialist kind of role. Like, I look toward the very, very bottom of the table, right? Florida Mayhem, Washington Justice. I mean, Justice, Corey, all season long, we've been talking about this guy. Anytime he gets off of Zarya, Washington Justice look like a totally different team. But anytime you put him on Zarya, which at some point in a 3-3 meta you're going to have to, it's not the same kind of performance level from them right now. And you can make arguments with Florida Mayhem that it's similar when you have players like Saya Player's Widow, right? Or BQB Somber, that we know can be really good, but hasn't just really slotted in very well.
Yeah, so I guess at the end of the day, the fact of the matter is the biggest losers are the teams already at the top, and the biggest winners are the teams that have been performing in middling to poor roles simply because their player staff isn't quite representative of the current meta.
Well, and this kind of circles back, lafon, to competitive integrity, which is something we brought up a little earlier. A giant change at the end of the season that just, kneecaps the top teams and gives a fresh horse to the bottom teams. That's funky, to say the least.
Yeah, and this has happened in back-to-back seasons now, if this were to come forward here in this season. And I think, aside from that, there's also one more thing, in that if at the end of this 2020 season, right, we're going to see Orisa played again, we're going to have to point some fingers and ask some questions, because that will have been 3 seasons in a row where Orisa becomes a well-played tank in the last stage of the season. Overwatch League is a show that started different twice, maybe potentially 3 times now, but the script always ends up cycling to the same stuff. Hopefully that won't be the case. Hopefully we'll get a little bit more variety coming into the end of the season, should this 2-2 role lock actually come to fruition. Thank you very much, guys, for watching this video. If you liked it, there's a button for that down below, and if not, leave us a comment. We're always looking to improve. Either way, subscribe to Elohel Esports for more Overwatch content.